Hi. Yes, Mr. Fernandez.
Senior Sergeant Weston, I'm going to return to you, and what I'm going to do is turn now in more detail to the use of force. There's already been mention of some principles relating to use of force. I'm going to have a document placed up on the screen. This is...
Sorry, it's not working either.
I understand the screens are not working at the bar table.
No, it's asked to be reconnected to the server for all of them. I think there might be an issue with the live transcription.
All right. Now, should I adjourn or do we just pause for a moment to
Perhaps we
get it working?
we'll need to adjourn, please, Chief Commissioner.
All right, I'll just take a short adjournment. We'll sort that problem. Tom or Steve?
going to ask for MTS 83 to be placed up on the screen. This is the Australian and New Zealand Policing Advisory Agency Use of Force Principles. The barcode is 8620200. Senior Sergeant Weston, there's been mention previously about the ANZPAR principles, and can you see them up on the, or in the
yes.
screen before you?
Yes.
Just want to, these are principles that that guide New South Wales Police as well as other Australian and New Zealand police forces, is that correct?
Correct.
The purpose of the principles is to provide guidance for jurisdictions in the application of policies and development of policies and procedures in relation to cooperation in terms of operational safety, namely the use of force. Is that right?
Yes.
The principles define the use of force as including any situation where police use physical force or other techniques, including a weapon, instrument or implement in the lawful execution of their duty. Is that right?
Yes.
In another document that I'm going to take you to, the New South Wales Police Force Manual, there is actually specific mention of what there's a specific description of weapons, instruments and implements. Is that right?
Yes.
Looking at the key principles set out there, what you can see is police should only use force that is reasonable, necessary, proportionate and appropriate to the circumstances. Police should use no more force than is reasonably necessary for the safe and effective performance of their duties, and individual police are accountable and responsible for their use of force and must be able to justify their actions at law. Can you see that?
Yes, I can.
Each of those principles are taught as in terms of initial training to police as part of the associate degree. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
As well as ongoing training of police in terms of use of force. Is that
Yes.
right? And that's what you have specific responsibility for, that ongoing training.
Yes.
As well as, of course, initial training for police at the academy. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
There are a number of underpinning principles. I just want to ask you about one. It's about the use of a situational model to guide police in the use of force. What does a situational model mean?
A situation model that we have in the New South Wales Police Force is referred to as the tactical options model, and that will outline what we refer to as the tactical options available to police to assist them in the environment and the situation that they have faced.
Are there a number of different models or approaches that police can take?
There certainly are. The tactical options model that the New South Wales Police Force use is non-linear, which means it's not a building block like a triangle other jurisdictions have used to suggest that you have to use weaponless control before you can get to OC spray, before you can get to firearm. It's about using your decision making and using the appropriate option dependent on the situation that you face at the time. It also allows for rapid escalation and de-escalation and assessment and reassessment.
I'm going to turn to the New South Wales Office of General Counsel Use of Force Manual. Chief Commissioner, I tender the Use of Force Manual. You should have it before you.
Yes, I do.
The barcodes for this document are 8620262 through to 8620273.
Chief Commissioner, I'm not against the tender of it. I did have a brief discussion with my learned friend prior to you sitting after the break. Could you please tender it? But I ask if you could pause on any access application in relation to this document. I just need to get one further instruction about that if that was to arise.
Well, is it about to be placed on the screen for the purpose of questions?
Yes, it is, and perhaps I can, just by way of assistance for Mr Coffey, I can indicate what pages will be placed on the screen by way of barcodes. Page 1, 8620263. Then page 5, 8620266. And page 6, 8620267.
Generally speaking, Chair, I'm content with that, and we'll kind of hold this process up. If that evidence could be adduced, and whilst that's happening, if I can just make some inquiries. The reason I'm adopting this approach is under the GIPA Act for FOI type legislation, there's certain approaches taken with this kind of material, and I just wish to make sure that I'm not traversing in doing something different here than we do elsewhere in a different jurisdiction.
I understand that. There is an interest in, subject to any specific issues, material of this sort being publicly available, I think. Obviously, if there are particular applications, then they can be made. But in some other jurisdictions, material of this sort seems to be often available. And perhaps I just make that comment at this stage. What I'll do is mark this as an exhibit, and the council assisting can proceed to use it in the way he's foreshadowed, and if there's any particular aspect or application you want to raise, you can do so.
I'm grateful, thank you, Chair.
All right. The use of force manual of the Office of the General Counsel of the New South Wales Police Force, with an effective date of 1 August 2022, will be marked Exhibit MTS 105.
Can I ask for this page to be placed up on the screen, please? It's 8620263. Senior Sergeant Weston, you also have a hard copy of the same manual in front of you.
Yes.
By way of introduction, this document is the principal document for the use of force within the New South Wales Police Force. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
The introduction notes that it provides instruction on when police may use force and the level of force police may use based on the legislation and the common law. Is that right?
Yes.
All training done for New South Wales Police on the use of force is done in accordance with what's set out in this document. Would that be correct to say?
That is correct.
By way of an essential summary, the document sets out that police may use force in 5 nominated circumstances, namely to arrest a person, to detain a person not under arrest in certain circumstances, to prevent a breach of the peace, in self-defence, or for the protection of property. Is that right?
Yes.
It goes on to state that force should be used which is no more force than is reasonably necessary to exercise policing functions. Is that correct?
Yes.
There's further explanation of these and other principles, and I'll take you to those in the document. Can I ask for page 8620266 to be turned up, please? And could we zoom in, please, on part 2, what is force? Senior Sergeant Weston, I took you to the definition in the ANSPAR use of force principles. The force is defined in the use of force manual as follows. Force includes, but is not limited to, firearms, round brackets, including draw and cover, end round brackets, handcuffs, round brackets, during a detention or arrest, end round brackets, taser, round brackets, including draw and cover, end round brackets, OC spray, round brackets, including draw and cover, end round brackets, baton, weaponless control. Can you see that?
Yes, I can.
There's also mention about the use of handcuffs in certain circumstances, namely the transport of a prisoner, not considered a use of force. Is that right?
Yes.
Just for clarity, what does draw and cover mean?
Draw and cover in relation to both the firearm and the taser or the CEW involves drawing the firearm or the taser from the holster and bringing it to a cover position, which is on the person that is presenting the threat toward the centre of scene mass. So if you're standing with no points of cover concealing any part of your body, generally the centre of your scene mass would be around your middle torso area.
Does that mean force includes the production of one of these implements or weapons without necessarily activation?
Yes, that's correct.
What training is provided to police as part of the associate degree in terms of each of those items firstly, and then I'll ask you about the circumstances in which they should be used.
Yes, so collectively within the ADPP, we have 14 hours of lectures. So that will, I'll go through the contents list in a moment, but that will include information on those appointments. Then we have 114 hours of defensive tactics, which again includes the physical application of those appointments.
Can I just pause you? When you say defensive tactics, what do you mean?
So defensive tactics will include weaponless control of physical skill sets involving the body without the use of a mechanical device, such as an appointment. Also involved in the defensive tactics will be ground defence, again, weaponless control. Firearms is standalone in the 60 hours. Handcuffs will be included in the 114 hours, as to baton and OC spray.
In addition, so this does this take place within the second schedule of the course? There's an online part, and then there's the actual part of face-to-face training at Goulburn. Is that correct?
Correct.
And is this training that you've just described during Schedule 2 the face-to-face training?
Absolutely, session 2.
In terms of a situational model, which I previously took you to in the ANSPAR principles, is the situational model used by New South Wales Police the tactical options model?
Yes.
If we just scroll down on the same page that we're at, 2.2 refers to the tactical options model, which is described as providing a series of options to consider when presented with a situation where police will contemplate using force. Is that right?
Yes.
I'll ask for the next page to be turned up, page 8620-267. Perhaps I'll just focus in on the actual model there. Can you see there what's set out as the tactical options model?
Yes.
You described it as a model which is not linear, that is, it doesn't follow a triangle, but it's dynamic, it's continual, is it?
Correct.
Just before I take you to the detail of what's contained there, what does the tactical options model provide to police?
The tactical options model provides to police what we refer to as our tactical options that are going to be best placed to deal with the situation that you're confronted with. You will see that we have 10 tactical options that are outside of the wheel. Within that, we have communication. Communication rightfully falls as a component of each tactical option that we will use. And just as importantly, we have assess and reassess, which acknowledges the dynamic nature of policing. We'll have to assess and reassess situations as they are unfolding. And this model itself lends us the ability to escalate as required or de-escalate as a situation calls for. You'll notice around the edges we have risk assessment, an action plan. That also forms a essential component of the police decision making. when we break down and look at officer safety threat assessments and risk assessments and the identifying of what a threat is, what a risk is, and what a hazard is, and that formulates a part of our plan.
Where does the options model begin? Is it at the safety first point of communication?
You could have that as your starting point. When I'm explaining this, as my colleague has said when we were at the academy, sometimes to sort of best describe it, we would suggest that the police officer themselves are in the middle as the safety first, and that's where it begins from there.
Where does the police officer go to from that starting point then?
Yep, it will be dependent on the situation that they are faced. It could quite dynamically escalate all the way up to a weaponless control situation. It might just simply be an officer present, so I might be attending a job. So I've gone to use my first tactical option. I'm attending a job, that's my officer presence. From there, I may very well just communicate with a number of people, and my tactical options might end there, and the job may be resolved.
Can you explain what's in the middle part of the wheel in between communication and the outer part of the wheel that refers to risk assessment, taking charge, etc.? There are a number of different options. I think there's 10 different options there. 10. Can you just explain how they work?
Absolutely. So they are the 10 tactical options that we have, the New South Wales Police Force. OC spray will be the using or the drawing and covering of the OC spray. Baton is our recruitment of the baton. Communication can be simple everyday communication. I might delve into a tactical communication or a negotiation as such. So communication has many forms. Tactical disengagement, depending upon the nature of the situation, I might be facing a high-risk situation, and my best tactical option is to tactically disengage. Weaponless control, as explained just prior, that is physical techniques involving the body without the use of any external mechanisms. Conducted electrical weapon is also known as the taser. We have the X26P currently, with a introduction of an updated model of the T7. Firearm, again, you have the Glock. Active armed defender tactics, they are different tactics that are employed if a situation that I face is deemed an active armed offender situation. Contain and negotiate, that may simply, again, be a high-risk situation where I may have employed tactical disengagement, but I still need to contain the situation. So, we move into taking command posts or areas where I can contain the situation to a point and enter into a negotiation, and then we're back at officer presence.
Does this tactical options model require or encourage a police officer to consider all of those different options within any situation?
Yes.
Could I just ask you this, just looking at the wheel, in the centre, as you say, safety first, assess and reassess. Then there's a black circle with communication written, and then when you get to the 10 items, one of the 10 items is communication. Is that intended to specify that the first thing to do is verbal communication, and that's why that's in the black circle immediately above the word safety first?
My understanding is communication plays a part in every tactical option.
Yep.
So it forms a part of every, touching each single option.
So that's the fact that it's there in the dark circle emphasises the importance of communication.
Correct.
As a constant, really.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
During the course of dealing with members of the public, police have to communicate with people from all sorts of different types of communication ability, including different language backgrounds, children, people who might not be mentally well, or people who might have intellectual disabilities. What sort of training is there for police in terms of communication with each of those different types of groups?
Yep. As we work in conjunction with the academic side, I'm not overly familiar with the entire communication in the curriculum there, but as far as a tactical communication aspect, I can speak to. We talk about, clear, concise directions, building rapport. We sort of go through the whole gamut. Understanding another person, breaking down barriers. We talk about, I'm just sort of trying to think what else we talk about. Understanding and making sure that the message is being conveyed and received, because I can, especially in high stress situations, I need to look for precursors or acknowledgements that that person is understanding my command, for example, and recognise myself that there is really no point escalating my level of communication following the same pattern if I'm not getting a response, and then altering my behaviours as a result.
The tactical options model sits beside something called the STOPAR, is
Yes.
that right? Is that an approach in terms of options to take?
Absolutely.
In terms of use of force?
Yes, so that's our critical thinking decision-making model.
I'll just ask you to pause there because we'll bring it up.
Perfect, okay.
So if the rest of the page can be scrolled up, please, that very same page. If we can try and get, yes, so there we go. You can now see on the page before you, 8620267, a description of STOPAR. Can you just explain what STOPAR involves?
Yes, so STOPAR is our critical thinking decision-making model, and working our way through this, I'll go through and explain the 6 stages that are within STOPAR. But when I do it might come across that it's actually quite stagnant. This is actually quite a dynamic model where I can move through and conduct a great deal of this almost on a subconscious level, but it's to help me identify risks, respond accordingly, formulate a plan to deal with something, act, and then conduct a review. So from the very start, what's referred to as STOP, I note that it says apply some critical thinking. From an operational perspective, that would be myself, if I'm the police officer, turning my attention to the incoming information. So that's stop and apply some critical thinking. I've noticed something that's occurring here. I'm now turning my mind to that incoming information. Think, how do you approach the problem without escalating the risk to self or others? Also, on an operational perspective, this is conducting an immediate assessment on the urgency of the incoming information to determine a response priority, whether or not it's urgent and I need to deal with it immediately, hence reducing the risk to self or others. Observe, your priority is public safety and the safety of self. This is actually a component where our threat and our risk assessments come in. I'm going to conduct an assessment on the immediate situation based on behavioural, threat and risk assessments. Plan, gather all available information, plan your approach, communicate with your partner, advise police radio of the situation. So the plan phase is a consolidation of the information I've gained from observe, and I'm going to formulate my strategic outcome, what I want to achieve. When I move into act, adapt your approach based on the risks and components observed. I'm going to identify what actions are required to achieve that strategic outcome based on legislation, policy and ethical behaviours. Then I'm going to move into my review. I'm going to continue to review the plan. Is it still doing what you want as effective? Are there any other strategies you can use? This component is actually twofold, so I'm not only going to review the job itself, and this is where our assess and reassess comes in. Is what I'm doing still effective? Do I need to reassess my tactical option, or am I continuing to achieve my strategic outcome? I'm also going to conduct a self-review as such to determine what jobs I did well and perhaps what areas I could improve on moving forward. So that's our STOPAR.
How is the tactical options model taught, so there must be a theoretical part of it which involves the actual model. Is there use of case discussions, scenarios, videos, anything else
Yeah.
to assist in the teaching?
Our curriculum's quite diverse. When I gave you the hour breakdown, we have to cover the physical component of each of our skill sets. So as far as that, we will teach by demonstrate, explain and practice, and we'll move through stages until our students are technically proficient in a static environment with a skill set. At the start and partway through lessons, we will reinforce learning. We'll touch upon legislation or justifications for uses of appointments, justified use of force, and so forth. And then we'll continue to build through, and once our students have achieved competency in the static environment with the technical aspects of our tactical options, we then move into a scenario-based, reality-based training aspect, and that gives the students the opportunity to pull everything together. So our theory components, our decision-making, our ability to conduct risk and threat assessments quite dynamically, also gives our students the opportunity to actually identify, what violent resistance looks like when an actual physical role player is displaying that. And then they have to move through the decision-making process quite dynamically and make that decision to perhaps use an appropriate appointment, go into weaponless control, any of the tactical options.
When you use the term in terms of reality, scenario-based or reality-based
Yes.
training, what does that actually mean? Does
Yes.
that mean acting out
Absolutely.
a
So
particular situation?
it's actually quite it's quite a massive part of our student learning. Once our students are competent with the static use of appointments or their tactical options, people such as myself, an operational safety instructor, will put on some safety gear because it is actually full contact, obviously in a controlled environment. And we will, the instructors will have a scenario and essentially, what outcome we want to achieve or what we're going to do. So it would be a job, for example. We have one where our two students might attend a public park, and the instructor is the role player, and I might be exhibiting, exhibiting some behaviours that look like I might be intoxicated, for example. And then our students have to start from the start and work their way through until finale of the job, getting to the review phase.
I'm going to ask for the next page to be brought up on the screen, please, 8620268. Could we go to the very bottom of the page, please, or to point 4 on that page, number 4? I was asking questions of Senior Sergeant Pocock
Yes.
previously about use of force being reasonable and the guidance given on that in terms of training. The manual in terms of use of force also sets out some guidance, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Senior Sergeant Weston, what can be seen is that police are required to exercise judgment in every time they use force, and in choosing the level of force that's appropriate, what should be considered are all of the circumstances, including, I'll just touch on these, the threat the officer is facing, the age of the person, the number of people the officer is dealing with, the number of other officers present, whether the person is affected by alcohol or drugs. And if we can just go to the top of the next page, please. Whether the person is suffering mental illness, gender, and size. Those are all matters that are to be considered. Is that correct?
Yes.
There's a further explanation in the document about the meaning of the term reasonable. The document is now in evidence before the Commission, so I won't take you to that. Can I take you then to Yes, thank you. That can be removed from the screen. Senior Constable Weston, I've asked you a number of questions about your involvement in terms of the use of force, training and the use of force. Is there any other aspect of training or ongoing training that you were involved in that hasn't already been touched on?
Perhaps noticed you were asking before about the decision making in relation to our ongoing training and how that's defined or determined. I can answer.
Yes,
that.
please.
I just have to refer to my list here that I didn't print out. I do apologise. So we actually have a 13-point decision making framework, and just as we spoke before, critical incident analysis, internal investigation outcomes, national and international research, emerging trends in operational safety instruction, commissioners and corporate directions, coronial findings and recommendations, Law Enforcement Conduct Commission recommendations, feedback from operational safety instructors and operational police, injury management statistics, environmental scanning, corporate reports, legislative requirements, and also the data obtained from COPS.
What is that a decision-making framework in relation to?
That's in relation to our ongoing mandatory training, those that the operational police undertake in a training period.
What you've just described is very much the practical aspects of the training. I'm going to turn to Senior Sergeant Pocock to ask whether there was anything you wished to add to the evidence given by Senior Sergeant Weston about training as part of the associate degree in terms of force and use of force.
The only thing I would say is that it's covered quite extensively.
Can I turn to you, Senior Sergeant Clark? What we've heard from is what's taught at the Academy, both for officers in training and then afterwards. Do you have, in terms of training in your role, any involvement with use of force or any provision of information or training?
Yes, we provide, most recent years, the mandatory training that we provide, which is separate to that the ANTH group does, has been powers related. And as soon as you've got powers, use of force becomes a consideration. And almost, I reviewed a couple of those packages. There's regularly reference to Section 230 and of LEPRA and use of force principles in relation to the use of powers and all of that training. For example, this year's package on search does talk briefly, at least about Section 230 and the use of force in relation to searching. At the moment, in terms of use of force, I'll carry on, is that all right?
Yeah, please, continue.
The use of force manual, which became available in August last year, that was made available on the intranet originally, and I think under the Professional Standards Command's website. Part of our group's mandate was to promote that manual as well, and the corporate sponsor, Assistant Commissioner White, asked us to provide an introduction and a platform for the presentation of that manual, which we did on the PEAT platform I've mentioned previously, which included a video recorded introduction to the manual by Assistant Commissioner White, and the presentation of the manual with that. That was in anticipation also of next year's MCPE, which relates to use of force.
When you say next year's MCPE, are you saying there's specific training next year on use of force?
That's correct. That's still being developed. That'll be for the 2023-2024 year, the training year. We usually start in July.
Are there a series of topics that are brought up for specific training year by year? Is that how that came about?
Every year, the practices from the LDDC, the group that I work for, we usually have about 2 training packages that we provide. And like, for example, this year we did police powers of search, and we did a victims package as well, which was a blended online and face-to-face. And next year we have 2 packages that I'm aware of, at least so far. that we will be producing.
You've referred to section 230. I'll just ask for section 230 and 231 to be placed up on the screen, please. Senior Sergeant Weston, you talked about decision-making having to be in accordance with legislation and what have you. These are the particular provisions that relate to use of force, both generally by police and then specifically in terms of making an arrest. What sort of training is there in terms of the practical scenarios or the reality-based training about reasonable use of force, which is reasonably necessary? How is that actually taught?
So that does play, well, that is included in our scenario-based training, including the reasonable use of force or acting within a lawful function. So even though the scenario itself is going to be quite dynamic, the student police officer has to identify that an offence has been committed, for example, and then dependent on the decision making, as a result of the threat assessment conducted by the student, determining which appointment, perhaps if any, that they are going to use. They'll have to be justified in their actions. For example, might be a discharge of OC spray. So the student will have to be able to justify, in accordance with the justifications for OC spray, that was done lawfully. And yeah, from there, moving through to, obviously, the scenarios go all the way through to control. So the scenario won't just stop with, as the one I've just mentioned, discharging OC spray. Obviously, the goal is control of the situation, to gain control. So the student will then move back to their communication, etc., to gain control of the situation.
Just on that point, one means of gaining and then maintaining control is through use of handcuffs. Would that be correct?
It would depend on my understanding of that question.
The particular case that this commission is investigating involves a young person who was apprehended by police. After his apprehension, there is evidence that he was held in handcuffs whilst sitting on the ground and with some blood coming from his head. And he was, in fact, handcuffed behind his back at a certain point in time. What training is there, guidance or anything else, about the use of handcuffs, when it should be used, when it should stop being used, any other situations in which it might be used?
Yes, so our handcuffing, do you mind if I just break down
please.
our content list for you, just so I can give you an exact overview, if you don't mind? Sorry. Okay, so our handcuffing, we have a 4-hour lesson at the sort of toward the start of our training, and that will cover justification for use of handcuffs. It will also include nomenclature, so we have 2 different types of handcuffs, so we'll go through and define both. We'll talk about theoretical components, mainly focusing on the justification, the decision-making to handcuff, before we move into the physical skill sets. Then we have a second 4-hour lesson, but in relation to the physical skill sets in handcuffing, a student will be taught to become competent in what we will refer to as compliant handcuffing, so handcuffing to the front. And when we talk about a compliant person and determining whether or not I will handcuff a person to the front, again, I'm having to conduct a behavioural or a threat assessment, and I will determine whether or not they are resistant, if they're resisting any passively resistant or if they're aggressive resistant will determine whether or not I'm going to be able to handcuff to the front or to the rear. So that plays a fair part in that.
Is the rear an escalation of handcuffing?
Not necessarily. Again, there's a number of parts to it. I might end up getting to a handcuffing to the rear situation by an armbar takedown, which is a weaponless control technique, and I will move into handcuffing to the rear. But I will also, upon assessment, depending upon my transport of my person in custody, if I'm transporting in a sedan, I have to handcuff to the rear for officer safety. Generally, with a compliant individual and I'm transporting with a caged truck, they'll be handcuffed to the front. So it's not always dependent upon the behaviours of the person. It might also be transport and officer safety.
Is there any training about situations where it's not necessary to either use handcuffs or not necessary to continue with the use of handcuffs?
Well, the decision to handcuff rests with you. That's a part of our justification. And by the word you, that is the person that's making the decision to handcuff. So the decision to handcuff rests with you. Generally, you're justified in handcuffing prisoners when they've tried to escape, to prevent escape or injury to themselves or others.
Senior Sergeant Pocock, is there anything that you can add to that in terms of training, in terms of use of handcuffs?
Yes, more generally in relation to use of force, we do have a couple of scenarios that we use.
Maybe perhaps just move down a little bit closer to the microphone.
So we do have numerous scenarios that we have within our curriculum. We also have a dedicated Avalius lesson. The Avalius lesson is
Could you spell that, please?
AVALIAS. An Avalius lesson is a lesson like a tutorial where students come into the room, they're put into groups, there's a facilitator who facilitates the lesson, they watch a series of videos. The videos that we use are actually body-worn video examples of real circumstances, and then they make an adjudication on like what they would do, whether they would use force, what sort of force that they would use. Then there's a discussion around that, their decisions. So that's one thing that's also in the academic component.
You refer to body-worn video.
Yep.
You've just given an example of the benefit there of body-worn video.
Yes.
In terms of training. What training is there about use of body-worn video at all?
There's a couple of references to it in our academic lessons. The need to give a warning.
Perhaps I'll just rephrase that to be a bit more specific. Is there specific training on the circumstances in which body-worn video should be used?
Yes. There's a master lecture that's delivered in relation to body-worn video, and it articulates that you should use body-worn video. And there's a list. I don't have the list with me, but it would be, whenever you're using a power, it's dealing with some sort of situation that might be of interest. If you're going to, so that power would include searching, arrests, all those sorts of powers. There is a list, but I'm not particularly have that at hand at the moment. But there is a specific lesson around body-worn video, and then the students do a series of practical lessons, which are part of the academic component. And in all those lessons, they use the body-worn video, and they actually turn the body-worn video on, and they record, and they give the warning, the body-worn video warning to the people involved, and they have to go and then download that content.
Senior Sergeant Weston, does your training involve any aspect of talking about body-worn video and the circumstances in which it should be used?
The body-worn is a part of training during the T7, so the taser training, as far as when operationally carrying a T7, you will also wear a body-worn.
What about other situations, potentially any situation where a police officer uses force? Is it taught that body-worn video should be used in that situation?
No.
Right. Do you know why it's limited to the use of tasers as opposed to all the other types of force that are available to a police officer?
Absolutely, that's a good question actually that needs an explanation. It's in relation to the T7 taser, which is a new taser that is coming in to the New South Wales Police Force. The previous taser, the X26P, had a camera built into the taser itself, where the T7 doesn't have that capability. Therefore, as a part of our training, from the onset, as a part of our structured lesson plan, we also go over the fact that operationally, when carrying the T7, you will also wear the body worn.
Do you involve in your training that operationally, when using firearms, handcuffs, OC spray, a baton or weaponless control, that body-worn video should also be used?
I'm familiar with, as undertaking body-worn training, I'm familiar that, you know, when operationally practicable to activate the body-worn, I know operationally things can occur quite dynamically, and, you know, if officer safety or the safety of somebody else is compromised as a part of my assessment, then I will attend to that, you know, and I perhaps won't be able to get to my body-worn in time. So I believe that those considerations should also be taken into consideration in an operational environment.
Wouldn't that situation that you've just described be exactly the type of situation where you would turn on body-worn video?
Yeah, look, in an ideal world, I would be able to identify your precursors, for example, from there in a standing position, although, you know, and I could think, okay, I'll turn on my body worn, but it could also be an exceptionally dynamic, you know, you could just all of a sudden be ready to shoot a firearm at me, for example, and I may have to react to that. So, you know, when safe to do or operationally practicable or safe to do so, yes, I believe that is a part of body-worn SOPs.
We talked about the tactical options model.
Yes.
And all those options open to a police officer.
Yes.
What role does the use of body-worn video play in any of those options?
Specifically as a part of our training, as outside of the T7, it doesn't.
Could I just ask you this, and it's possible it's been covered it's been covered in one way or another, but in your scenarios,
Yes.
training, these are largely young men and women coming into the police office without any background in, no military background. Some might, some don't. Usually younger, on the younger end, 20, 21, thereabouts. Do you use real-life cases of body-worn videos to illustrate good examples of how things can be done, and perhaps also bad examples of how things shouldn't be done, being real-life scenarios which are a byproduct of the availability of body-worn video? Is that used as part of the training of young police?
In our physical training component,
Yep.
It is not. However, in relation to videoing, we do video some of our reality-based scenarios and go through a debrief with our students, and that is for exactly what you just raised there. They can actually physically see, you know, we might talk about a triangle of safety, bladed stance, reactionary gap, and, you know, there might be 3 or 4 students that have done exceptionally well in that area, and collectively we get to review that, step through the process of what worked well, what didn't, as a learning tool itself in a training aspect, but we haven't used body-worn.
In some circumstances, and as an agency with access to body-worn video, one tends to see quite a bit of it. You can see examples of situations where an otherwise tense circumstance may be de-escalated by a calm verbal approach being taken, and sometimes the opposite. If one is, the officer is forceful, loud, directive, then a tense situation may become even tenser. Isn't the real life situations like that a good way of showing police officers what can happen and how to deal with it?
No, I believe you do that.
Yeah, Chief Commissioner, in the Avalius lesson, we do use real life examples of taser footage.
Yep.
Some that depict excessive use of force or inappropriate use of force. Some that are what we would call textbook, if you like. An appropriate use of force is provided. We also have a particular scenario which is video recorded, which is a removal of some intoxicated person from a licensed premises, and it demonstrates the person is passively aggressive in the sense that he's not a direct threat. However, he's objecting to the removal, and we demonstrate how we might talk to that person and take a little bit longer to achieve the aim of removing the person from the hotel without having to go hands on with a weaponless control. Just demonstrating really the communication aspect. So there's specific video lessons in our curriculum that address that.
Yes. And apart from body worn, there's also CCTV that's everywhere, and there's hardly a criminal case that doesn't have some in it, which can pick up incidents involving police and members of the community apart from body worn, and is product of that sort used in training, namely CCTV of the non-body worn type.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
In the same way as you've just described it,
Yes.
capable of giving a real life illustration of situations.
Yes.
Right, thank you. Yes, Mr.
Senior Sergeant Clark, from your perspective, is there anything available to police about use of body-worn video, perhaps leaving aside the standard operating procedures, but is there anything else available in terms of the circumstances which body-worn video should be used?
I don't provide, or we don't provide anything on use of body-worn training purposes
I'm going to turn to a different topic now. I'm going to start with you, Senior Sergeant Pocock. I'm going to ask you about policing in plain clothes. So this is not undercover policing, but general's duties policing in plain clothes.
Could I just ask one thing before you move
course.
into a new topic, Mr. Fernandez? Coming back to handcuffs, is there any training of police about the use or non-use of handcuffs with young persons, or any different approaches that may be taken in the use of handcuffs if it's a young person? That's an open question to all three of you.
No, from a physical application of handcuffs, we will still go through the exact same officer safety procedures, talking about our stance, application, applying front or rear. There is reference to hand sizes because of the actual fixed and swinging arm on both handcuffs. If you have a very small person, could be an adult even, and both, and even with the handcuffs on as tight as possible before moving through to full ratchet, we don't have security of the wrist. There is a technique where we can apply both hands together with the two handcuffs over the top, which alleviates that problem. But that's not directly referenced to a small child. It can also be to an adult.
And in our academic component, we don't have specific to young persons. We just teach them that it needs to be reasonable, necessary, proportionate and appropriate. And we go through those 4 points, and if it doesn't meet any one of those, then it's an incorrect use of force.
Just to finish off, the use of force
refers to in all the circumstances, and we've already looked at part 4 of that, which talks about the circumstances, including the age and the size of the person as well, which is a consideration for what force and what level of force is used.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Fernandez.
Senior Sergeant Pocock, is there any training as part of the associate degree about policing in plain clothes? So general duties policing, is there anything covered on that?
the only thing that we cover is in relation to the IPE or 201 of LEPRA, which provides that if you are in plain clothes, you must provide evidence of being a police officer. That's the only real context that we would get.
Senior Sergeant Weston, is there anything in part of your training that you provide about policing in plain clothes?
In the ADPP perspective, no. In our ongoing training in relation to physical use of appointments, we might be using different holsters, OC spray canisters, etc. But again, that is the physical application of training.
What about body-worn video in plain clothes and operational ability? Is that discussed at all?
Not with us, no.
Senior Sergeant Clark?
As Senior Sergeant Pocock's indicated, the safeguards are where this seems most relevant, where our obligation under Part 15 of LEPRA is to inform, let the person know that we are police officers and who we are and the reason for arrest, etc., or use of the power, and that it seems obvious and more incumbent on those officers to make it known that they are police officers. And usually, calling out to stop police and identifying yourself as a police officer, whether or not you've got time to pull out your badge is a consideration for the circumstances of the use of the power.
Senior Sergeant Clark, I'm going to start with you in terms of this next question. I asked you questions previously about cases and law and your experience as a police prosecutor and how information might or might not be shared within the organisation. I'm going to ask for an exhibit to be placed up on the screen. It's MTS 7070, and I'm going to ask for page 8543630 to be placed up on the screen, please. I wonder if we could just, Senior Sergeant Clark, this is a judgment of the Supreme Court by Justice Adamson back in 2013, and we actually had the solicitor who was responsible, who acted for the young person in this case, give evidence at this investigation. I just wonder if we could focus on the catchwords, please. So without really going to the details of the case, I just want to show you these catchwords. It refers to sections 138 and 139 of the Evidence Act, that is impropriety and cautioning of witnesses. Then it refers to improperly obtained evidence, failure to caution the accused, interview conducted notwithstanding the initial refusal to answer questions, section 90 of the Evidence Act, unfair deprivation of right to silence, advantage taken of vulnerable person, 15-year-old girl. Just looking at the catchwords and nothing else, that's quite remarkable in terms of what that case was about. How would something like this case, how would that be dealt with within, firstly, the police prosecutors? Is there sharing of information about cases and the latest law relating to admissibility, for example?
I mean, obviously, admissibility is an issue. 138 and 139 are within the purview of the discretions of the court. I do not know what the considerations in that case were, and as you know, 138 has a long list of considerations and issues. It's section 90 as well, issues of fairness. Look, it would raise a flag. I'd be interested to know what was in that, but yeah, to be honest, I don't know the case. The issue seems to be around the questioning, unfair deprivation, right to silence. Yeah, it may be interesting, and I would probably seek to refer it to the appropriate person dealing with issues of admissibility or impropriety, and also I think, personally, if I see interesting cases relevant to a particular group, I'll forward it to them. And something like the detectives training unit might have been interested in something like this. That was something I regularly did, even when I was working for the prosecutors. I would email interesting case law to the appropriate person in the detectives training unit.
This was a decision in 2013, in about November of 2013, and I understand between 2012 and 2018, you were actually a trainer
Yes.
in the Police Prosecution Command. Is that right?
That's correct.
If you read this case or another case like it, in addition to raising it with prosecutors or an interested person, would you realise that something like this would relate to police practice more generally? Would this be something that you'd want to be telling the trainers at the academy about, so officers in training can be taught about issues such as this?
My main concern with the prosecutors was providing information and training material for the prosecutors. That material would generally be made available to the police generally, and so they'd have access to that information. If there
How would that happen?
honestly, we used to post all our material on the internet, so it would be available. But it would be up to the trainer dealing with that area of law as to what they did with that. You know, I haven't read this case, so I can't comment on the how it might have affected anything that I dealt with or wrote. But there would be, if there was a need for the escalation, given this Supreme Court decision, you'd hope that police were paying attention to it, and it would have been escalated through the appropriate channels to be dealt with appropriately.
Senior Sergeant Pocock, how would a case like this come to the attention of you as being a person coordinating the training for police?
We do again do environmental scans, so sometimes we'll pick up on particular cases. They can be from just our own research. It can come down via some external body through to the police, such as coroner's court, or not this one specifically, but this specific case, I suppose. I think there was a discussion earlier about whether the work that Mr. Clark does, how it might go to us. I think it was a significant issue, and there has been some significant issues. It would go up to a certain level of maybe assistant commissioner across and down. I'm not particularly aware of this specific process, because I'll get files from my commander saying, have a look at this, do we cover this appropriately? And I won't interrogate that as to where it came from so much as I'll just look at our content to see. I'll go through these points, we'll read it, we've got some, even in my unit, I think there's 3 solicitors, previous solicitors, working for Charles Sturt University, that are in my direct unit, which we'll give to, and we'll say, let's tease out the issues here that are going to affect, firstly, our students, and is it at their level, and 2, then do we address it, and do we address it sufficiently? And then we'll make a determination, and then we'll modify or we'll enhance our curriculum according to that determination.
What training is provided as part of the associate degree in relation to interviewing children specifically?
In relation to interviewing children specifically, of course, we teach that least restrictive actions. We specifically...
This is interviewing, though.
Yes, yeah, but what we teach is, and I won't go. I don't know that we teach specific to children, because what we will teach is, what we do teach is that you either, if a person's back at a police station in custody, and you'll give them to the custody sergeant. You will ask the custody sergeant if you can interview that person. The custody sergeant will make a determination, or custody officer, will tell you whether or not, this is what we teach, whether or not you can take that person for an interview. And then we teach that body-worn video is not can't be just, it's not a replacement for ERISP. However, you'll find yourself in situations, students will find themselves in situations, or police officers do, where you don't have a appropriate arrest situation, yet you may want to interview the person. So in those circumstances, you would offer the option of them to come back to the police station. Some circumstances will be, I'm happy to be interviewed, but I'm not coming back to the police station. So in that circumstance, it's a notebook interview using your body-worn video. We also teach that they're not to interview or ask questions of a young person without a support person. So we would, there's one particular scenario where it's a graffiti situation and graffiti doesn't fit under the Young Offenders Act. They're held by security, police arrive, they don't want to give their details, so we take them back to the police station because of their age, there's a duty of care as well. It's in the middle of the night, and then we teach that you have to bring the parents in or arrange for those persons to go home and then an interview to occur later. So,
Are you saying that police are taught to place that young person under arrest for a graffiti offence and
No.
take them back to the police station?
no, the circumstances may arise where, if you've got 99.1A, 99.1B, 99.3, you may need to arrest. So they're not specifically told to have to arrest in a graffiti situation, because the overarching least restrictive form of sanction applies still. It's just that we're trying to teach students to think critically, look at the situation, bring all the information in, such as duty of care, and how we then proceed from there.
Is there any training or giving of information about people in custody, specifically Aboriginal people, having the right to legal advice before speaking to police? And what's the training around?
Numerous times they're told that they must be given. We teach them that the custody manager is the one who will do this. However, all vulnerable people, of which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, must have the right to legal advice and a support person. So,
is there any training about what the consequence is of getting that legal advice? So in a situation where a person gets legal advice and does not wish to take part in an interview, what are police trained then as to what they can do with that person?
they're trained to take the advice of the custody sergeant. So in that situation, the custody, that's why we teach our students that they are to go to the custody manager and ask the custody manager if they're permitted to take the person in for an interview.
Is there any training available to, as part of the associate degree, about protocols agreed to by the Commissioner of Police with legal aid and more generally about interviewing of people in custody, including young people?
No.
Is there training about the right to silence?
I don't think specifically. So we teach the general principle. There would be, yes, the general principle, but I don't think we explore that specifically or give scenarios where that might occur. Other than in the Young Offenders Act, in relation to the PAS, the Protected Admission Scheme, we talk specifically to the fact that if a young person decides don't want to say anything because they believe they could, there could be repercussions for them, then we teach how the Protected Admission Scheme is there to assist that young person to, I suppose, go down the path of being able to be dealt with under the Young Offenders Act, as opposed to if they didn't say anything.
The right to silence as a proposition is implicit in a caution, I suppose.
Yes, we teach the cautions significantly. So yes, I guess in that sense we do.
Yes, Mr.
If a Senior Sergeant Pocock, if a person says, I don't wish to have an interview, doesn't that involve the exercise of the right to silence?
Yes.
Wonder what do you train police in training about that, about a person saying, I don't wish to give an interview? Is anything further taught police about that situation?
The only reference that we have really is that one example of the reason why a custody sergeant might say you can't take the person for an interview is that they've received legal advice. That's written in it, but it's in the training.
Are you saying that very much what is being taught is that the arresting officer really is having significant regard to what the custody manager is advising them?
Yes, and we've got to remember we're talking with students. Yeah, so we're not talking with experienced constables or senior constables or detectives. Our training is for, students who don't understand necessarily all the implications.
At some point in time, those students do become senior officers and experienced constables or senior constables.
Yes.
How do they then get that training?
One way is in their probationary year, they do 100 shifts of policing, and they've got a field training officer who is their on-the-job trainer, if you like, and supervisors in the field and custody managers who all steer that student towards the skills, requisite skills necessary to be a confirmed constable.
Senior Sergeant Clark, can I ask you about, in terms of your levels of responsibility, what material is made available to all police about interviewing suspects and specifically about interviewing children?
I honestly can't comment on interviewing. That would be something that the investigators courses and the detectives training courses would have.
I know the answers to that question, and it may be that we've had other witnesses giving evidence, but there's certainly the investigators course that a constable does within their first 2 to 3 years that deals with these exact issues. Plus there's different grades as you move up into detective, so it may be that I can provide a written note or something about that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Coffey.
Bearing in mind there might be some more information, in terms of material being available on intranet or through portals, to your knowledge, is there any resources available on that very issue?
Again, I really haven't interrogated the detectives training materials in relation to that, so I really can't answer that question. I apologise.
Chief Commissioner, note the time. Could I have a very short adjournment?
Yes,
just for 5 minutes.
Yes, could I just ask one thing before we do adjourn? Just using the FE decision, which has been subject of some questioning, the catchwords on the front page. Could we go through to paragraph 113, the page with the barcode ending 654? Bring that up on screen, thanks. It's the top of the page. Could we zero in at the... Now, Justice Adamson said, I regard these improprieties as very grave. The accused's right to remain silent and not be compelled to answer questions that might tend to incriminate her in the commission of the crime of murder has been described as a fundamental bulwark of liberty, which is not merely a rule of evidence but a basic and substantive common law right, with a reference to the High Court decision in Reid versus Howard. And then going to the bottom of that page, paragraph 117, had the accused been advised of her legal rights, then it is, in my view, highly unlikely that she would have answered any questions at all. Her avowed wish to tell her story was born of her naivety and her ignorance, both of her right to silence and the potential consequences of self-incrimination. There is no reason to suppose that she would not have accepted the advice that would almost inevitably have been given to her had she received legal advice, namely to refuse to be interviewed. And then finally, the next paragraph, to adapt the language of the plurality in the King versus Lee, in the judgment of Chief Justice Latham, Justices McTiernan, Webb, Fulliger and Kitto, a High Court case. A 15-year-old girl whose command of English is not sophisticated and who is suspected of a serious criminal offence may be practically helpless in the hands of an overzealous police officer whose position of superiority is so great and so overpowering that admissions may be made which, if the girl knew her legal rights, would not be made. Now, I've just gone to those quotes because isn't this a very good case to emphasise the importance of the right to silence, applying to young persons in demonstrating the bedrock principles and some of the particular difficulties that can occur with young people who are less developed, more susceptible to naivety, and thus, in a police station, perhaps more vulnerable, which is why they're classified as vulnerable persons. And I just raise with each of you the utility of this decision to demonstrate to trainee police officers the importance of these principles. Would anyone like to comment on what I've just said?
Yes, Chief Commissioner, I think it's a good case that, I agree, it is a good case that we could use in our curriculum, yes.
Senior Sergeant Clark.
Without having read the case,
Chief Commissioner, I find it hard to comment, and given that this is it is the impropriety that the court has found, or the improper use, as the court has found, is subject to many factors, and I'd have to look at the case in terms of what is demonstrated there in terms of the ability of the girl, the age of the girl, the circumstances of the matter.
I can understand that one needs to read the whole case, but that's one of the reasons for using case studies, isn't it? This is a publicly available decision of the Supreme Court of New South Wales, placed on case law, so it was available to the whole world in 2013. It includes the basic principles and some of the circumstances which a Supreme Court judge found warranted the exclusion of an interview in a murder case nearly 10 years ago. It seems to me to be a very vivid and living example of problems that occur in interviewing of young persons, and I say, regrettably, on the evidence before this inquiry, persist in different forms nearly 10 years later. So that's why I'm raising it. It's necessary to read the case, but in the end, it's powerful and effective reading to assist young police officers and old police officers and experienced police officers to understand the challenges and pitfalls and the responsibilities which they have as police officers in dealing with young persons. So that's perhaps my answer to your question, Senior Sergeant Clark. This seems to me to be a very good example of how cases should be captured by the police force and utilised in training and continuing training. Would anyone like to comment on that observation that I've just made?
I'd have to recommend it to the appropriate people to consider in terms of the training, especially for the investigators, Your Honour.
We do, Chief Commissioner, indicate several times where before any interview you've got to consider legal parameters, and one of those is the age. That's in our investigations lesson, which is about early on. We're always looking for good examples which demonstrate what can come from that. So, on the viewing of this, it would seem that they'd be good little snippets to use, especially in our situation.
This isn't an abstract example out of a university exam paper. It's a real life example out of a Supreme Court judgment in a very serious case where the judge took the very substantial step of excluding an interview that apparently contained admissions. That's why I've raised it. Anyway, yes, Mr. Fernandez.
Could we take a very short adjournment, just 5 minutes, please?
All right. I'll adjourn for about 5 minutes. Feel free to stand up and move around as long as we're ready to resume in 5 minutes. So I'll adjourn for 5 minutes. Yes, Mr Fernandez.
That completes my questions.
All right, does anyone else wish to ask questions? Yes, Ms Lee.
Thank you, Chair, Commissioner. Is this microphone working?
Sorry?
You can hear me? The microphone is working?
Yes, yes.
Hello, my name's Samantha Lee. I represent YPM1 and I'm from Redfern Legal Centre. I just have some further questions to ask, particularly around the use of force and training materials. Having listened to the information you've presented today, it does beg the question, well, what's going wrong? In the case of my client, he at the time was a young Indigenous boy, 13 years of age. It's still up in the air whether there was any reasonable suspicion as to whether he committed an offence. He was then chased by police and tackled and allegedly punched and had a horrible injury to his head. The training provided does seem to cover a fair bit, including the use of force, body-worn video footage, communication. So every time something goes wrong in terms of the use of force, the issue of training is inevitably raised. And I guess I'd like to ask you the question, do you think there is too much emphasis on training and too little emphasis on other areas, such as the need to reform culture, look at monitoring and accountability in terms of the New South Wales Police?
Who wants this?
Well, I object. Yeah. With respect, these officers are subject matter experts which have come from the Police Force Education Command, for want of a better word, because their name's changed. I'm just not sure how these subject matter experts can give an opinion in relation to policing, and whether it is appropriate that these officers even be required in their forum. They are, with respect, although they're senior police officers, they are not members of the senior executive of the police force, and I'm just conscious in terms of what use their opinion could be to the purposes of this investigation.
You want to say something, Mr Fernandez?
On consideration, I support the objection made by Mr Coffey.
There was a lengthy preamble to set the scene, Ms Lee, and then I'm just looking to see what the question itself was. Do you think there is too much emphasis on training and too much little emphasis?
Maybe I could put it another way.
I think the position is that I won't allow that last question, and you can put another question and we'll see if it draws an objection. Yes.
Well, who else do you think should be here present today giving evidence about the use of force? Is it just education and training?
Well, no, I object. The whole point is that these are not the officers who should be asking that question.
Ms Lee, if that's a question, I suppose it can be directed to the Commission and not the witnesses. Now, you ask questions by leave, as you understand. That's not a question I think these witnesses can fairly answer, so please put a further question,
Yes.
if you wish.
Commissioner. We talk about training. Well, let's just start first with the name of police, which is the police force, which was changed back from its name police service back in 2006. Do you talk about that change of name in your training?
No.
Do you think that the use of the term force is different to the use of the term service?
Yes.
In what way?
In relation to initial training, students enter into a environment where there's seniority, and and that seniority isn't necessarily something that they're used to. And they have to understand that when they come into something like the police, that there are certain obligations on them in relation to being given directions to do things or having to comply with a senior officer. And I think primarily that's the environment that we try to demonstrate to our students, that they are accountable to someone higher up the line. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I don't hold the opinion that there is a difference between force and service.
I acknowledge the different words, but I honestly haven't contemplated why they're using those different words.
All right, thank you. Just in terms of going to the training manual, we've been given in evidence today use of force manual. Is that the only use of force manual available to constables or the police force?
In relation to operational safety instructors, we do have some content which we rely upon as in a lesson plan that will be related to operational safety. But for constable's access, they don't have that.
Right. And are there any standard operating procedures around the use of force?
I'm not aware of any operating procedures. There are other materials. We have like a SMIT as well about unreasonable use of force. There are other materials available, but the principal document, as is indicated on the beginning of the manual, is this document.
Okay, thank you. I see in the document there are no specific chapters in regards to children. Do you think there should be a chapter specific about children and the use of force?
What, this is in the use of force manual exhibit MTS 105.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm unable to
I guess that question needs to be prefaced against the fact that in evidence the Commission's aware of other documents. This document isn't read in isolation.
Yeah.
Do we include in this particular document vulnerable people, different sexes of people? This document is supposed to be a higher level document read in conjunction with such things such as the police handbook that relates to children and young people. So I'm just not sure what the utility of adding additional material to this would be.
Well,
I mean, I'm just looking at paragraph 4, which identifies a number of factors, including age. That's a general statement, I know. But when one looks at this document, it is one expressed in relatively general terms. You're asking whether there is utility in having in a document such as this a particular part that deals with young persons.
that's correct.
All right, now would anyone like to express an answer to that question?
When use of force in an operational context, as an operational police officer, I'm not simply relying on that document alone. I'm also taking on legislation, powers, etc. So I believe that I gather that information in conjunction with materials there.
Yes, thank you. That's not the question. Do you think there should be a specific chapter or part within this manual that actually draws out the issue of use of force against children?
I think I would have trouble answering that, wanting to know, figuring out what would it be specifically added for. In the instance of using force against a young person, I do have the factors that age, gender, size, skill and fitness level is a factor, and that is referenced in the document.
What about the Young Offenders Act though?
That's not my area of expertise. I'm only use of force.
So you don't look at the use of force in conjunction with the Young Offenders Act?
I look at use of force in conjunction with risk and threat assessment in the dynamic environment operationally. And that is basically what it does come down to is threat assessments, risk assessments, not just operationally for police, but members of the public as well.
The Chief Commissioner referred to Part 4 of the manual, which already references the considerations. I think there's a complex matrix of considerations that you'd have to consider, and the potential of numerous chapters. Yeah, I'd find difficult given the amount of policy documents police are already expected to absorb. There are already other documents that relate to the Young Offenders Act and processes in relation to children as well that cover a lot of those issues as well, I think.
And recently, obviously, we've seen the unfortunate use of force against a very old woman. And in the case of my client, a very young, not so big and lightweight young boy, does the police force teach, does the police teach its force about physicality and the impact of force on different physical or elderly or young people, like the impact of using handcuffs on such groups of people in terms of injury?
In terms of injury, we have to evaluate the risk to injury versus gaining control of a situation, for example, and the control would be the reason why I'm using the force. We do consider the risk to injury in that respect. That does form a part of our assessment as a consideration for minimal injury if possible.
How is that taught? How do they learn about that?
That would be, I could perhaps go through in our physical aspect. We talk about control, pain compliance. That forms a part of our weaponless control and how it's achieved with pressure and counter pressure, and the techniques that are designed for to gain control of a person, which are the least. How would I say it? Apologies. Designed to produce the least injury to a person, the minimal injury as a result of applying downward pressure and counter pressure on fulcrum joints.
I think those considerations under Part 4, as well as the 4 things that ANZPAR principles tell us and that are reflected in the manual as well, relating to is it reasonable, is it necessary, is it proportionate, is it appropriate, sort of make those considerations, in all the circumstances, the vulnerability, size, age, are obviously factors that should be considered in relation to all of those issues. So that is taught, that is in the manual, that's highlighted in the manual. And we do highlight some of those things in the use of force training that we are presenting, with some scenario-based training as well, getting people to recognise those issues when they are making decisions.
Thank you. In terms of training, does anyone provide training to higher up the ranks, to the superintendents, local area commanders, commissioners, or is the emphasis on training just on the constables?
I've been a part of mandatory training for assistant commissioners, deputy commissioners. I haven't personally been involved in training of the commissioner, but certainly at that executive level I have actually managed the training on multiple occasions.
Mandatory training that we provide is, when it's for all sworn staff, it doesn't distinguish with rank, and I think all are required. I've had the pleasant experience of providing the training to many ranks up to Deputy Commissioner. And
do you provide training? You said, I think, oh, maybe I've got it wrong, but someone was providing training on COP system.
Yeah.
Yes. Do you provide training on importing data into the COP system?
Yes.
Yes.
Information.
Sorry.
Sorry. Yes, I do. Information into COPS, yes.
And are you aware on the COP system the use of force input?
Yes.
Yeah. Are you aware of the LEC's recent report on the use of force?
Use of force reporting.
Use of force reporting?
Yes, I am aware of it, yes.
In that report, it found that there was, sorry, what's the word exactly? Well, there was a overwhelming, I think it's called, underreporting of the use of force of people using this actual COPS system.
Yes.
Is that something you would take note of in your training?
We've already amended our training to in COPS, and also it's in our academic training, which indicates that whenever use of force is used, you must update COPS to indicate the use of force, and you also must indicate if any person involved in that altercation was injured.
Just looking at paragraphs 9 and 10 of the use of force manual, exhibit MTS 105, they deal with those topics. 9, every use of force must be recorded in COPS at a minimum. 10, if any person is injured during the course of a police operation, whether from the use of force or otherwise, it must be reported to a supervisor immediately and must be recorded on COPS.
Chief Commissioner, we had a reference, however, we thought it, due to the LEC inquiry, we thought it was appropriate to, I suppose, boost or enhance that learning for our students.
Well, that's highly desirable because experience has shown there's something of a gap between having a rule like that here and what actually happens in practice. Do each of you accept that it's of fundamental importance that any use of force, particularly use of force causing injury, must be reported in COPS?
That is a requirement, yeah.
And the reason for that, is it not because it's necessary there be an accurate picture as to what force is being used and with what consequences, to allow an accurate understanding within the police force as to the position?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. That is reflected in the manual and in the training that we are providing next year. We're highlighting the need for the recording of use of powers, use of force, not just the use of force, but the nature and circumstances of the use of force and the use of the power.
Can I ask you in conjunction to that, was there any monitoring of this database system in terms of the use of force before the LEC report?
I don't have that information, I'm sorry.
So how do you know your training education is doing what it's meant to do? Is there any evaluation or monitoring of how this is working on the ground?
There are quarterly use of force reporting that does occur.
And what does that report?
That reports statewide and does break down via region any use of force arising, highlighting any trends, etc.
And do you get that database from the COP system?
It's drawn from a number of systems, including COPS.
What would be another system?
Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with the Power BI reporting system. I know that is what it's called, but I'm not 100% certain of the data that comprises.
So there might be another system in which force is being recorded?
Can I object? Could I just inquire how this relates to the terms of reference in respect of this particular young person?
Talking about systemic issues here. We need to know how it's operating at all levels, not just in education.
Well, there is a broader context here, but these are 3 training witnesses and there may be an outer limit of their capacity to answer these questions.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I should be clear that the objections rejected, is directed at these officers in terms of how these officers are training officers who are not involved in that type of area.
All right, but look, what I'll do is allow the question to the extent that the witnesses recall it, and we can go back to it based upon their own area of expertise, and if they can answer it, they can answer it. If they can't, they can't. So the question was, I'll just go back to it and look at it. Senior Sergeant Weston said she was unfortunately not familiar with the Power BI reporting system. I know that's what it is called. I'm not 100% certain of the data that it comprises. Ms. Lee asked, so there might be another system in which force is being recorded. Are any of the present witnesses able to answer that?
I'm able to.
I think Power BI draws from COPS and other systems, so I suspect it's all drawing from the same data source.
What's the other systems though?
I don't know, to be honest. Yeah, there are multiple systems, not just COPS. Yeah. I couldn't enumerate them, I apologise.
I think Power BI relates to HR issues as well. So a lot of the information comes not just from the operational side of the equation, but HR issues such as it even includes sick leave and things like that. So maybe that's my
Yes, Ms. Lee.
understanding of Power BI.
Yes.
Sorry, thank you. Just wanting to touch on the police accountability system called Compass. Are you aware of this system?
I don't have any operations with Compass.
I'm aware of the system, but I have no involvement in or.
I've heard of it, but I don't have any access or involvement.
And in terms of your training, I think it's been drawn upon a bit here, but how much is your training inputted by analysis and data? For example, you mentioned the use of force. So do you get external input that drives your training in terms of data analysis of what's happening on the ground?
I made reference to a 13-point decision-making framework. I can go through that again. It does involve areas where we obtain data from. Would you like me to go through that again?
So can I ask you, it includes the use of force, and does it include any information about young people?
If we're talking itemised use of force, sorry, I'm trying the best way to define this, because there's a number of different factors with the decision framework. My use of force reporting to suggest that Northern Region have drawn and cover the taser 17 times in a month will not suggest that it was 3 times with a young person involved, but additional data that I might be drawing from a critical incident, for example, might identify that that person was a young person. So perhaps with all information combined, I might be able to get a direct overview. Naturally, again, in that 13-point decision-making framework, coronial findings, recommendations, etc., they may define a young person being involved.
We in the academic component do at times liaise with external agencies and bodies. For example, 2 years ago, we reviewed our topic or module relating to young people. We worked closely, we worked with the President of the Children's Court at the time, Mr. Johnston, Chief Justice, and also Magistrate Skinner. We worked closely with them to ensure that the curriculum that we delivered was appropriate from the perspective of the court. So they had a big actual input into that curriculum.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple more questions. You mentioned training around, I think, First Nations issue. Do you cover the deaths in custody and the Royal Commission recommendations?
We have two lessons on First Nations. I'd have to go and have a look. We've got over 100 and something lessons, so I'm not exactly sure the content of those lessons. However, those lessons have been were actually recently reviewed by one of our sergeants from the Police Academy, who is a First Nations person and is trained in that area as well. So,
When you say 2 lessons, how long are they? How long is a lesson?
1 hour and 50 minutes each.
So you have about 4 hours of the training around Aboriginal deaths in custody.
No, I wouldn't say we had 4 hours around Aboriginal deaths in custody, because for our students, custody issues are probably not the primary point for our students at their level of learning. We have a whole module on communities at risk. So we talk about, there's an introduction, then there's vulnerable persons, of which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are included in that lesson. There's 3 lessons on mental health, 2 lessons on Aboriginal or first Torres Strait Islander, and some other lessons. And that's deliberately placed at the start of our curriculum to emphasise the importance of those communities and the way we police those communities in a fair and professional manner. So that's a decision to put that module at the start of our content.
Could I just ask, just to clarify, Sergeant Edgell gave evidence about training in the custody management area, and it was my recollection that he referred to some coronial recommendations, and it may well have been the Deaths in Custody Royal Commission too. His area is separate to your 3 areas, is that
He
a fair
comes
comment?
within the LDDC.
Yes, yep, all right. Yes, Ms Lee.
Thank you. Just in terms of body-worn video footage, there was some discussion about that. Do you think it would just be easier for it to be mandatory
Sorry, I object. What is the actual question?
for body-worn video footage to?
That's a submission you could make to me, ultimately, Ms Lee. I think asking these 3 training officers, I don't think that advances this inquiry, so I don't allow that. There's an argument about this. You've read the reports of this commission at times. There's a lively discussion about it, but asking these 3 witnesses that question, I don't think advances it. So next question, please.
Well, Your Honour, in my case with my client, there were 4 officers and none of them had body.
I understand that. That's why it's an issue about which we'll be getting submissions.
Wouldn't it make the training just easier to say wear it?
That's an argument you can put to me ultimately, Ms Lee. Next question, please. We're in the evidentiary phase.
Just one last question. I mean, what you've been providing today, it's very interesting and it seems like you're covering a lot of ground. And really, it's a lot of training, a lot of areas. I guess to sum it up though, in the heat of the moment, when all that training is at the background and you've got an officer in a situation, what do you think can help that officer at that moment to ensure that they're being able to draw upon that knowledge?
Sorry, Your Honour, but that question with respect is too vague in terms of the circumstances. I'm not sure how that can assist you.
As I understand it, the question is this: you can have the training, and the training covers many things, but police officers are in the field in a variety of circumstances, often confronted with things, short notice, sudden challenges. Is there anything further that can be done to assist them in practice at the training level to deal with what may be the unexpected challenges of daily policing? I understand that is putting it another way.
Yeah.
Perfect.
What I can say is at the academy, we're always looking at ways in which we can make our learning more effective. Outside of the influence that I have, which is in that scope, I can't comment, but we try and look at our learning, and we can see if we can create efficiencies, and create linkages so that the learning and the memory of our students is, I suppose, or assist the students in the uptake of the information and the learning, to put them in the best position they can to draw on that information later.
By design, our training is quite similar as well. Obviously, through repetition of physical skill sets, we become more proficient with the skill set itself without the actual need to stop and give deep, detailed thinking. I can move through all 4 stages of the draw quite proficiently and, within a split second once I've practiced that skill set a number of times. So, by design, that is the aim and the intention of our physical training, that, in an unfamiliar or in an environment in a high stress situation where, I will lose certain dexterity, my fine motor skills, perhaps I have sensory exclusion. By sheer repetition of a physical skill set, I'm competent enough to be able to continue through that and complete that to the same degree as I would have in a static environment.
When officers come back for annual refreshers, is it the situation that clearly they've acquired some experience in the past year and that becomes a cumulative process? Is that a fair statement? That
Yes.
Do the updates involve any process, if I could put it this way, of trying to get rid of any bad habits as well as encouraging good practices? How is that done in practice?
So when we're coming back and we move into the skill set again, we'll start with a revision component, and the physical skill sets the lessons are constructed by way of demonstration, explanation and practice. So we'll give a dynamic demonstration, we'll break down the technique itself into steps, and then we'll go through each step, building up the repetition through to completion. But you are correct, sir, we do start with a revision component just to make sure there's no degradation of skill sets, and what skill set is retained is technically proficient, and then we build up again from there.
Within the limitations of the parameters of the training that we have available to us, and we've sort of explained a little bit of the mandatory training and other frameworks that we've got, I think we're getting better, and I think we've already. I think we're cooperating more with the units that are other training units as well, and that we're looking for consistent messaging and things like the use of force manual, and that are steps along the way to getting overall policy and direction with everyone getting on the same page. So, acknowledging that we can always do better and that we need to look at ourselves all the time. I think we're getting better at looking at, we talked about the repeated, consistent messaging that needs to come from the college all the way up, and have that, like the powers training that we do deliver. At the moment, every year we're trying to put a powers package together, and we're looking at that same sort of messaging and building the messaging. We've got the search manual, we've got the use of force manual, we're developing better policy, I think. And we've got things like one of the initiatives in the Constable Development Program is that they're not only required to do mandatory set of courses, but they're also meant to go and review the courses from the last 3 years, I think it is as well of the mandatory training, so that they're not just falling behind. And so I think we're on the right track, but I think that repetition and consistency we'll keep learning from these experiences that we've got.
Thank you. Just one final question, Chief Commissioner. Does your training take in the issue of police culture, like the culture of the workforce and how that impacts on all this good work that you've been doing?
I don't deliver training on culture per se.
Culture doesn't play a part in the physical training that we develop and teach.
It does or it doesn't?
Sorry, it does
Doesn't.
not, no.
No.
I think my response to that would be we try. we try to instill into our students the culture aspects and the professionalism that our hierarchy or senior executive team promote through various policy and procedures and things like that. Yeah. So we don't go and address what the culture is out there. We try and establish a culture in that student that will move forward. And if I can, we do address the Royal Commission and Aboriginal Girls.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just check.
Thank you.
We mentioned previously the Peel's 9 principles, and I think one of the documents we provided was the statement of values as a key document for the police, and that's very much our starting point. And in terms of culture, hopefully we're guided by these many high-level documents and ideas that we strive towards.
The Code of Conduct and Ethics, Statement of Values, Peel's 9 principles. That's the way in which we would
Hope our culture
influence the culture through our students.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.
By the statement of values or by that term, does that encompass that section 6, 7 or 8 in the Police Act, which
Yes.
sets out the mission and
Yes.
the values,
Yes.
which are fundamental to policing?
Yes. That starts from lesson 1.
Yes. All right. Thank you, Ms. Lee. Any other?
No, thank you.
All right. Mr. Fernandez?
No questions arising.
All right. Well, could I thank each of you for participating today? I think the process of it being done as a type of panel discussion has been the best way of obtaining the benefit of your evidence. As has been obvious, some areas are more within one of your areas of expertise than others, but at the end of the day, by hearing from each of you, we've covered a range of topics. So the Commission is grateful for your attendance today, and if you would like to step down in a moment when we adjourn. Mr. Fernandez, adjourning till tomorrow?
Yes, but yes, Your Honour. Yes, Chief Commissioner.
All right. There's nothing else anyone wishes to raise, so I'll adjourn until 10 o'clock in the morning. Adjourn.